When I first got into photography, one of the things that confused me the most was why there was such a huge range in cost when it came to photographic equipment. Why are these cameras so differently priced, and especially why are these lenses so differently priced? Why can I get a 70 to 300 millimeter lens for a few $100, but a 70 to 200 millimeter lens, which can't even zoom as far, why is it almost $3,000? I could not figure it out. And so in this section, I want to lay it all out on the table and make it very, very easy to understand for you. So right in front of me here, I have three different levels of camera by Nikon. This is the Nikon D5200. This is what we're actually using in this tutorial to teach you guys. This is the D750. It's one level up. It's still like a prosumer level camera. This is the D800, which has now been replaced by the D810, which is a professional level camera. And then Nikon actually has one step further, which would be the D4 at this point. D4 is more made for sports photography and really high speed photography. But that would be the highest level in Nikon's tiers. The D5200 here costs $500, the D750 cost $2,000, and the D810 currently costs $3,000. So you can see there's a huge jump in price here, and I want to explain to you guys really quickly why those prices are so different. The first thing we'll talk about is sensor size. It's the actual size of the CMOS chip that is capturing the picture in each of these cameras. When you hear the term full frame camera, what people are talking about is a full frame lens, which is the size of 35 millimeter film. Both the D800 and the D750 have a full frame sensor. It's the exact same size as the old 35 millimeter film that you're accustomed to. The D5200 here has an APS-C size sensor, which is significantly smaller. And there are pluses and minuses to having a smaller or a larger sensor, but for the most part, you're going to be able to get slightly better quality images out of a larger sensor simply because the photo sites on that sensor are bigger. I remember years ago when photographers were obsessed with megapixels, and we thought if we had more megapixels, the image quality would be better. Now things aren't quite so simple. With the $500 5200 here, it's a 24 megapixel sensor. With the $2,000 full frame D750, it's a 24 megapixel sensor. The $3,000 D810 has 36 megapixels, so you can see we're getting more megapixels with this camera and it costs a little bit more money. But then if we went up to the D4S, which is the sports camera that Nikon makes, that would be a $5,000 camera that only has 16 megapixels. So as you can see, judging a camera's quality based on the megapixels alone just does not work anymore. And so you can't say that because your camera has a lot of megapixels, it's worth a lot of money or it takes a better picture than a camera with less megapixels. Instead of megapixels, the new king of photography is ISO performance and dynamic range. And ISO, as we've talked about before, is how well the camera can shoot in low light. If you're shooting in very dark conditions and you bump that ISO up, you make your camera very, very sensitive to light. How clean do those images look? And then the other half of that is dynamic range. How much detail is actually captured and held in the highlights and the shadows of these shots. Once you get further in your career and you start taking your photos into Photoshop or Lightroom afterwards and you start tweaking the way your images look, you're going to want a camera that has more dynamic range because it gives you more ability to play with those files. So as you can see with Nikon's most expensive camera that I don't have here, you're actually paying the most amount of money for less megapixels. And what's also interesting is in many cases when it comes to professional cameras, you will pay more money for less features the higher up you go. And you'll notice on the D5200 here, we have tons of shooting modes and all of these auto settings. And you know, I could go to portrait mode, or I could go to mountains or landscapes or macro mode, and I can add effects in camera if I wanted to make my pictures black and white, or I wanted to add color or blurring or whatever. When you move up to the D750, I also have a rotator knob that has different shooting modes, and I can change the scene, but it has less options than on the D5200. And then when I move up here to the D800 or D810, it actually takes away all of the shooting modes. So I can't set my camera to landscape mode, I can't set it to macro mode, because at this level, Nikon assumes that you know what you're doing and you're going to want to set the camera manually. That's why I haven't taught you what these other modes do yet on these cameras, because once you get past using them and you actually figure out how to control your camera manually, you won't ever use these automatic settings again. You'll also find with a lot of the cheaper cameras, they've added other features like Wi-Fi or built-in radio remote, so that you could buy a $15 remote control and remotely trigger your camera. Once you get up to the more expensive cameras, they remove those features. You don't have Wi-Fi anymore. You have to buy some extra chip that costs $100. If you want to have a remote control, now it costs $150 for this specialized thing that screws into the front of the camera. It is a little strange the way that camera manufacturers actually remove features the more you pay, but that's not the full story. You do gain some things as well. One thing that you'll notice right off the bat is how much smaller this camera is than the other two cameras. And I personally have big hands, and if I'm going to be shooting all day, you might initially think that you'd want a smaller, lighter camera, but I actually find the bigger camera much more comfortable to hold. You'll also notice that the build quality of these cameras is totally different. The D5200 here is just made of plastic. It still feels fairly sturdy, but it's obviously made of plastic. But once you move up to these other cameras, they're made of magnesium and metal, and they feel much more sturdy. They're obviously going to last a lot longer when you put them through a beating. One other thing that you'll find is the higher up you go in the line, the more weatherproofing there is. So if you just open up these little doors on these cameras and look, there's no weatherproofing at all here on the D5200. But if I move up to the D800 here, you can just see the way that it's built and the way that the rubber is made. It's gonna be holding moisture out of these cameras. And we actually filmed for 3 months recently with the D750, which certainly isn't the highest level camera that they make. We use this camera in the rain day after day after day, and it never took on water, it never broke, which is really amazing. You would never be able to do that with the D5200. One other huge difference that you'll notice when you pick up each of these cameras is the farther we go down the line, the more buttons and knobs we have. And I know that sounds kind of silly, but there is a reason for that. When you're using the D5200, there's a lot of double holding of buttons, as I like to say. So I'm like holding this button, which can do 2 or 3 things, and then rotating just one rotator knob to change the aperture, the shutter speed, the ISO. And I find it a little bit confusing. It's also a little bit slow when you've used one of these other cameras. When we move up to the D750, we have 2 rotator knobs, one on the front, one on the back. That makes things a little bit quicker. And then when we move up even further to the D800 here, or the D810, you can see that we've now lost the rotator knob that you've seen on the other 2 cameras, which I almost never use anyway. And we have a mode button, and we also have white balance, quality, bracketing, ISO, all as buttons up on top here. If you're a professional photographer and you find yourself shooting a lot, you are going to appreciate having more buttons and knobs to use. It's gonna be a lot quicker to take pictures and change your settings than trying to use a camera that has less buttons and is trying to actually cram different functions into the exact same button. You may be saying to yourself at this point, why in the world would I spend thousands of dollars for an upgraded camera when you might lose some features, the image quality may not necessarily be that much better? And it's not quite that simple. I think over time, as you get more into photography, you'll figure out what you're missing and what features you're actually looking for. If you want better ISO performance, then it'll be a no-brainer to jump up to one of these higher quality cameras. Now, you may have also noticed a huge difference when it comes to pricing with point and shoot cameras. Why is this little Olympus camera here $100 and this Sony camera here $500? Well, many of the same principles apply to both DSLRs and point and shoot cameras. When it comes to this camera, why does this camera cost so much? Well, you're paying for a slightly larger sensor. It's gonna have a larger sensor than this much cheaper point and shoot camera, which is going to perform better in low light. It's gonna have better ISO performance. You're also going to have more dynamic range and more detail in your images. You're also paying for a wider aperture. This aperture in particular can go from f3.5 to f6.4 as you zoom around, which is fairly wide for a point and shoot camera. I know, for instance, Sony does have one that's even better than this. I think it's a $1,000 point and shoot camera. They can go down to 2.8, which is pretty incredible. The other thing that you're paying for, though, is the manual settings and the manual features. The fact that this has a little rotator knob that you can set each of the settings just like you do on a DSLR. It has a rotator knob here in the front where you can set the aperture. Obviously, none of that is going to exist on a cheaper point and shoot camera. So when you're buying an expensive point and shoot camera, you're basically paying for the same features that you would on a DSLR in a smaller package. One other feature that I haven't mentioned yet, which really does get significantly better as you move up the line, is focusing speed and power. And you will notice if you've ever used one of these cheaper DSLRs, it does not focus very well in low light. It also doesn't give you that many focusing options. I'm not gonna get into all the options that you can get into when you especially get up to the D4S level. But basically, in low light situations, this camera will not be able to focus as quickly or as accurately as the more expensive cameras. You'll also find that as you move up, you get more focusing points. So if I wanted to frame up a shot but focus on the right side of the image, that's going to be a lot easier with a professional level camera like this than it is with the D5200. Now, of course, that does not mean that you can't get the exact same looking shot with the D5200. It would just require that you frame the shot, focus, reframe, and shoot. I really do that anyway when I'm using these pro level cameras, but you will have more options when it comes to focusing the more expensive and the higher up the line you get. Being that digital cameras these days are changing so rapidly, if you're just now getting into photography, I would suggest buying a cheaper digital camera, saving your money, and putting that money towards better lenses, because lenses are replaced every 5 to 7 years and they hold their value much better, and you'll see a much bigger difference in image quality with a high quality lens over the kit lens that came with your camera. So in front of me here, I have two lenses. I have the 1855 that came with the Nikon camera, the D5200. Basically, this lens is just free in the box. That's how cheap it is. And then here I have the Nikon 24 to 70 millimeter f2.8 lens, and I believe this lens costs $1,700. Why in the world do these two lenses cost such different prices? Well, let me break it down for you. First of all, this lens that came with the camera is a DX lens, and this means that it's made for a crop sensor. It's made for a sensor that is smaller than a full frame sensor. In our example before, the D5200 is a crop sensor camera. Also, the Canon camera, the Rebel that we're using, that is a crop sensor camera as well. One of the benefits to having lenses that fit on crop sensor bodies is the lens physically doesn't have to be as big. Because the light isn't shining on as large of a sensor, the glass itself can be much smaller, and therefore it's going to save you a lot of money. One thing to keep in mind when it comes to crop sensors versus full frame sensors is your millimeter, or the way that a lens performs on that camera, will be a little bit different. Therefore, an 18 to 55 millimeter DX lens or crop sensor lens will look the exact same. It will have the exact same field of view as this 2470 2.8 lens on a full frame camera. Now, one other thing that you'll notice the second you pick these lenses up is the 18 to 55 is once again made of cheap plastic. And just the way it feels, the way that it zooms, the way that the focus works, nothing about this feels really well made or professional. I don't think this would handle a fall very well at all. When you pick up the 2470 here, this thing is so heavy. It's made of metal. When you feel the way that this thing zooms, it just feels like it's really well made. The focus ring just feels very smooth. It's just another caliber of craftsmanship. And of course, you'll also notice how much more glass there is on the front of each of these lenses. Now, the number one reason that lenses vary so much in their cost is their aperture. And as we know, this Nikon 18 to 55 that came in the box, this is called the kit lens that came with the camera. It has a 3.5 to 5.6 aperture. And what that means is, as you zoom this lens around, the aperture will actually change. At its widest level at 18 millimeters, the aperture will be able to open up to 3.5 aperture. That's as wide as it can go. But if you zoom in, as you go up to 55 millimeters, the aperture will actually close down and will get smaller and smaller to f5.6. f5.6 is the widest aperture you can have when you're zoomed into 55 millimeters on this lens. That doesn't happen on professional lenses. Not only does this lens have a much wider aperture at f2.8, It's a consistent aperture. So I can set my lens to f2.8 and I can zoom all day long and that aperture will remain wide open. That's one of the reasons why these lenses are such different sizes. Because this lens is so large, the way the mechanism works inside, shifting the elements around, it doesn't actually have to stop down the aperture as you zoom around. Obviously, it's going to be a little bit more convenient to travel with a lens like this, but professionals will always choose a constant aperture lens like this over this one if they had the chance. Now, it is possible to put a crop sensor DX lens on a full frame camera, but you really wouldn't want to do that because the light coming out of the back of this lens will not fully illuminate a full frame sensor. And therefore, your camera will go into DX mode or crop mode and you're going to lose megapixels on the edge of your frame. You're really not taking full advantage of the camera when you use a lens like this on a full frame camera. Now, on the other side of things, you can use a full frame lens like this on a crop sensored camera. And in that case, it works much better. Keep in mind though, that at 24 millimeters, that's as wide as this will go, it will appear wider on a full frame camera than it does on a crop sensor. Because keep in mind that this lens is casting light in a much larger area than a standard crop size sensor. A few years ago, full frame digital cameras were incredibly expensive, and all of my cameras were crop sensor cameras, but I used full frame professional glass just like this. And then when full frame cameras started to drop in price, I was able to upgrade my cameras, but I never actually had to upgrade my lenses. That saved me a ton of money in the long run. In front of me here now, I have two telephoto lenses. This is a 70 to 300 millimeter f4 to f5.6, and this is a 70 to 200 millimeter f2.8 lens. And as you can imagine, the price difference is insane on these lenses. This 70 to 300 cost $170 brand new. I'm sure you could get it less than $100 used online. The 70 to 200 millimeter 2.8 lens is priced just over $2,000. And I have to tell you, it's worth it if you're a professional. This is by far my favorite lens. Everything that this lens shoots looks amazing. But you probably are wondering, why in the world does it cost so much more? Is it really worth that? Why is this one so much cheaper? Now, when I first got into photography, I thought that you were paying for the zoom range. I thought you were paying for the millimeters of the lens. And if that were true, then this lens should cost more. It goes from 70 millimeters all the way to 300 millimeters. It's a lot more telephoto than this lens. This lens only can go from 70 to 200 millimeters. So why then is the price so different? Why does this lens cost so much? Well, it's for the exact same reasons that we talked about with the last lens. First of all, build quality. This lens is made of cheap plastic, and as you zoom this thing around, you can just tell it's not very sturdy, it's not built that well, it's not going to be able to be beat around. It doesn't feel like a very professional product. When you hold the 70 to 200, again, this thing feels so heavy. It just feels like one block of metal. You're gonna be able to drop this thing on the ground. It's probably still going to be able to work. This thing is actually so heavy that it has its own tripod mounting plate on the bottom. So if you snap this to a camera, you don't want the weight of this lens pulling down on that camera mount. So if you're going to mount it to a tripod, instead of mounting it on the back of the camera here, you'd put your plate here so that the camera and lens would be balanced. Now, just like the last example, the main reason why this lens costs so much more and the main reasons why it's so much bigger is because it has a constant aperture of 2.8. With a wide aperture at 2.8, you're gonna be able to get much more light into the camera. It's gonna perform much better in low light. You're also going to be able to get much shallower depth of field than you are with a lens like this. But most importantly, as you zoom around, it's not going to be changing the aperture. We have the same problem with this lens that we had with the other kit lens, and that's that the aperture is variable. So at 70 millimeters, the widest aperture we can set this camera to is f4. But as we zoom into 300 millimeters, the aperture will automatically stop down to 5.6. So as you zoom in, you're obviously going to lose some light that's entering the camera. It's not gonna perform as well in low light, but you're also going to lose that beautiful shallow depth of field that you can get with this lens, which allows your subject to be sharp, but the background to go blurry. One other huge feature that this lens has that this one doesn't is vibration reduction, or VR. Each camera manufacturer has their own name for this. Canon's, for example, is IS, or image stabilization. You can see these letters after the millimeters on each lens. What VR does in this lens is it basically has a moving element inside which is trying to counteract camera shake. As you move the camera naturally, just trying to hold it steady, this lens has a moving element inside which should give you sharper images, and it will allow you to shoot at lower shutter speeds handheld without using a tripod. This lens does not have that option. You can get this lens with that option, and it bumps the price from $170 to $500 for the exact same lens. So you can see it is quite a pricey feature. This is why I suggest new photographers spend any extra money they have buying higher quality glass rather than the newest, hottest camera that's currently out. In many cases, the technology that goes into even the cheapest level cameras right now is so much better than the cameras we had just 3 to 5 years ago, but the lens technology hasn't changed much at all. I actually bought this lens probably 5 years ago. It works just as well today as the day that I bought it, and the cost of this lens has actually gone up in value over time, whereas every camera I've purchased has plummeted in value as a new camera gets released and replaces the old one every single year. Let me show you here how we can actually fit a $2,700 lens on a $500 camera. Works perfectly. It's really funny how unbalanced this is though. The cheap plastic camera weighs almost nothing compared to this lens, but I can tell you, you're gonna be able to take beautiful shallow depth of field images with this lens and this camera. Nobody's going to be able to tell that you're using such a cheap camera because the glass is really what makes your pictures shine. Now, as you can probably imagine, you're also going to get sharper images with a higher quality professional lens. And if you compared an image straight up out of the 70-300 versus the 70-200, you will notice a pretty significant difference when it comes to actual detail and sharpness on a pro lens like this. Something else that you may not have considered though is that vignetting is an issue on a lot of cheap lenses. And basically vignetting is just the darkening of the edges of the frame. In many cases, photographers these days are actually adding vignettes to their finished images. It makes them look more finished and complete. But basically you don't want your lens to just vignette every single image because you're locking yourself into a look that you may not necessarily want. So if you notice like how much larger the front element is on the pro lens versus the cheaper consumer level lens, one of the main reasons for that is because this lens is going to do much better with vignetting. An image is going to look perfect right out of camera, whereas this one's going to really suffer from darkening of the edges, especially when you zoom in a lot. So I hope this has helped you guys. I know when I got into photography, trying to figure out why camera equipment was so wildly different in pricing drove me crazy, but it's really not that complicated when you think about it. For camera gear, it's all about build quality, it's about sensor size, it's about dynamic range and ISO performance, and with lenses, it's about constant wide apertures and build quality as well. If you're still on the fence and trying to understand why you would spend so much money for a wide, consistent aperture, let's head outside now and I'm going to show you how your aperture choice can completely change the look of your pictures. So we're out here now with Chelsea and the much more expensive 70-200 2.8 lens, and we're gonna be stopping this lens down from f/22 where it has the smallest aperture all the way to f/2.8, and I'll explain a little bit of the benefit of buying this lens over the 70-300 cheaper lens. But keep in mind, this is really a professional lens, and if you're not a professional photographer, it's definitely gonna be overkill for you. But for the sake of this demonstration, this lens is going to do best. So first what we're gonna do is start at f/22 and let's take a shot here. As you can see with the shot, the background's slightly blurry here, and that's because Chelsea is so far away from the background, but for the most part, we can still tell what's in the background. Let's go ahead and stop down to f/16, take the same shot again. Keep in mind, guys, I'm changing my shutter speed so that we're getting the exact same exposure with each one of these shots. As you can see, we're getting a little bit blurrier here. We're gonna stop down again to f/11, same shot. Even blurrier in the background. We're gonna keep going. f/8, a little blurrier. 5/6. Now at f/5.6, this is where we really start to see the difference in the 70-200 version, which is much more expensive than the 70-300. Because with the 70-300 millimeter lens, 5.6 is as wide as the aperture will get at this zoom range. So if we wanted a really blurry background, we can't make it any blurrier with the cheaper lens. But of course, this is the professional lens that has the 2.8 aperture option. So we have 2 more stops that we can go, making that aperture even wider and getting an even blurrier background. So I'm going to go here from f5.6 down to f4, and let's take another shot. Much blurrier background, a lot prettier to look at. And then we're gonna stop down all the way to f2.8. This is where I love to shoot with this lens. And now you can see we have that beautiful creamy background. Obviously you can tell that it's trees back there, but I think it looks like a much more professional looking shot. But keep in mind, for the most part, especially if you're just getting started with photography, the 70 to 300 millimeter lens is an excellent zoom lens as well.